It's no surprise we have a lot that we could talk about if we want to talk about top 10 worst anything. Hell, we could do top 10 worst products that launched in 2025 if we want.
Top 10 worst top 10 lists.
That's next week's video. Anyway, today we're going to talk about is the top 10 worst PC products ever. Although it only goes back to about 2003, but that's okay. I think the last 23 years has given us a lot to talk about. So let's go ahead and get into it. Let's talk about the stuff, and what's funny is there's one company that's on here more than once and actually more than twice. Now here's the thing. I could do a top 100 if I wanted. I could do top 10 in the last 1 year, 2025 alone, if I wanted. But today I just kind of stuck to what I consider to be kind of like some products from each of the sort of categories of PC. Some of them you'll notice on here are the same category more than once, but that's because they had maybe some huge blunders more than once. There's also no real particular order. It's kind of in the order of date, but some of them are out of order. The order of this really doesn't matter. It's just, that's the way I presented it. So,
your 2 cents, right?
Inflation, Phil, it's Jay's nickel. This is, so number 1 for oldest is the NVIDIA GeForce FX 5800 Ultra. I remember this graphics card actually. It was the NV30 architecture, 130 nanometer process. So funny when you think about today. 128 megabytes of DDR2, 128-bit bus, and 75 watts of power. Now, the thing was, it was meant to be a contender for the Radeon 9700 Pro. And on paper, it looked competitive, but the architecture struggled with shader-heavy DX9 workloads, and NVIDIA optimized heavily for synthetic benchmarks rather than real-world game performance. And the infamous dual slot, because remember back then a lot of graphics cards were single slot, the dual slot Flow FX cooler made it extremely loud, which gave it the nickname the Dustbuster, because it actually sounded like an old Black & Decker Dustbuster, and it was just really slow. In fact, it was so slow, NVIDIA really quickly pivoted to releasing the FX 5900 redesign. Here's what's so funny about this list. Number 2 is that 2004's Intel Pentium 4 Prescott. We all remember that. I think we got one right over there. Anyway, it's funny because it was built on Intel's NetBurst technology. The pipeline only had 31 stages, and it was a 100 to 115 watt TDP. That's what's crazy about that. And Prescott was Intel's doubling down on clock speed scaling. Remember, it was like the earlier days of tick-tock. Anyway, it lengthened the pipeline. And unfortunately, when you do that, you increase latency and such. But Intel could hit higher gigahertz numbers, but its IPC dropped significantly, and real-world performance gains were minimal compared to earlier Northwood chips. And heat became a serious problem. Don't forget, 115 watt TDP for a little chunk of aluminum coolers, which is kind of all you had back then. Big tower coolers were starting to become a thing, but they didn't need to be a thing. Intel made it become a thing. And it's kind of funny because they did that shit all over again 20 years later, but I digress. Poor efficiency, high power draw, and the AMD Athlon 64 outperformed it per watt and just overall performance. So the reason why I say number 1 and number 2 are so interesting is because you have NVIDIA losing to Radeon, and you have Intel losing to AMD. Now Radeon and AMD are the same thing, but it's just so funny because it really shows how much things have changed over time. But the long-term impact for Intel was it killed the whole NetBurst architecture, which led to Intel really pushing forward Conroe or Intel Core, which has basically led to everything we know today. But as we know, Intel really leaned heavily and so heavily into Core, it never really got out of Core, which is why it fell behind. Number 3 should come as no surprise. This isn't even hardware. This is from 2007, Microsoft's Windows Vista. Okay, hot take. I had Vista, I used it at work. I kind of had to because we had Vista machines that were in deployment. I liked it. I didn't have a problem with it. I even liked the arrow and all that shit. I was hated back then in my organization as well, just for saying that. But I didn't have a problem with it. I liked the visual aspect of it. I thought it was okay. But the problem was it had some major changes to WDDM or driver models. And so what it had was huge incompatibility problems with a lot of devices that were out in deployment already with like keyboards and mice and printers and not really displays and such. But there was a lot of compatibility issues with Vista. But the issue wasn't the OS design, it was just its timing. And drivers weren't ready, GPU vendors were scrambling, OEMs labeled low-end machines as Vista capable, but they weren't because Aero was actually pretty intense in the whole animated background and the animations when you opened up Windows and stuff. So it led to OEMs saying, it's Vista ready. All it could do truly was install Vista, but then the hardware was so under-spec'd for it, it was a very sluggish, bad user experience, which led to just the timing of Vista and the hardware integration and such with it was just bad. Now, like anything else, it leads to forward progression of things getting pushed forward to handle it, but it's just the timing of it was really bad. It's an ecosystem, it had huge instability problems, it had aggressive UAC prompts. Everything you clicked was like, are you sure you want to do that? Yes. Are you really sure? Yes. Stop asking me. Okay, I won't ask you till I ask you next time. Are you really, really, really sure? Yes. Are you really, 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 really? But it led to Windows 7. Okay, and Windows 7, as many people even today are still running, consider that to be the best Windows that has ever existed. Number 4. We can fast forward all the way up to 2018. NVIDIA makes the list again with the RTX 2080 Ti. Now you might be looking at that going, well, why? Well, Turing architecture was okay, right? At 11 gigabytes of GDDR6, but it normalized 4-figure GPU pricing. NVIDIA really leaned on the whole real-time ray tracing aspect. This is the future of gaming. Gaming and with real-time ray tracing and real-time global illumination when it comes to ray traced shadows and ray traced sunlight and all the things that you could trace right in real time. The problem was there were no games really out that could truly take advantage of it. It was I think it was a list of something like 13 games or something at launch that could potentially use it, but the hardware was so infant at the time. When you turned on real-time ray tracing, or RT at all, you took such a performance hit, it became a huge meme. And once you turned off ray tracing, the performance uplift from 20 series over the still infinitely best GPU architecture of all time, Pascal, and the 1080 Ti, the performance lifts just weren't there at double the price of a 1080 at $1,200. So it makes this list specifically because it really launched and solidifies NVIDIA's we can charge whatever the hell we want mentality. And that is all we've seen since then. 8 years in the making so far. And as we know, it just continues to move forward. But the other thing that made it kind of a blunder was the initial launch of DLSS as well. And we all know DLSS 1.0 was a huge, hot mess. It was fuzzy, it was blurry, it had artifacting everywhere, noise all over the place because of the upscaler just not being matured. And it also makes this list because it was one of the first times we saw quote unquote AI integration into anything consumer product. Remember, deep learning super sampling is upscaler based on AI. And that started a long time ago. Now we know DLSS has gotten really good over the years, but back then, the early adopters, it was super, super painful. In fact, 2080 Ti is one of the very few cards that I didn't really run because I ran RTX Titans. So number 5 on this list with a 2020 recall is the NZXT H1. So the NZXT1 was a small form factor case. It was a skyscraper style or a vertical style where it was a small footprint, but it was tall and everything was kind of on its side and the GPU goes up and down. And when you have an arrangement like that, you've got to have what's called a riser cable to move the GPU to whatever side of the case it needs to be on because it can't slot directly into the motherboard and then still maintain that small form factor. So unfortunately for NZXT, the riser cable which they sourced didn't go through proper QA, QC validation to make sure that everything there is, on the up and up in terms of safety. Now the problem was you got a metal screw mounting down this riser cable, and the riser cable itself, the holes for mounting, was a multiple layer PCB having a lot of PCIe signals go through there, and more importantly, 12 volt and ground going through there. And with different planes or different layers to this PCB, just like a motherboard or a graphics card, you've got to insulate that hole to make sure the metal screw that you're putting through there is not bridging or grounding things that shouldn't be touching. Unfortunately, because it was such a minor contact, it wasn't enough to trigger like overcurrent protection or anything like that in a power supply. But what it was able to do is slowly continue to increase the heat in that area until it eventually caught fire. And it got to the point to where a recall was established and needed to be handled. Now, there was a huge controversy about whether or not the recall was already in the works versus someone like Gamers Nexus putting huge strain and pressure on the company to issue a recall. There was a lot of finger pointing and he said, she said. NZXT says, hey, we already had the recall in the works, but it got accelerated because of the coverage. And then rightfully so, the critique was saying, when you're dealing with fire and you're dealing with safety like this, there should never be a reason to not move as fast as humanly possible on something like this. So that's why it really blew up into a very big, not really, I don't know if scandal is the right word, but a really big controversy where safety was involved and people didn't feel like the brand was moving fast enough. And that critique led to a whole domino effect of fixes trying to be implemented to where it led to just the complete retirement of that case entirely. But it's kind of funny, the H2, or the new version of that case, which was actually debuted at Computex, looks like a complete redesign and actually something I'm really interested in taking a look at. So keep your ears peeled for that. But it looks like there was maybe some huge lessons learned from that fiasco, if you will, in the last 6 years. So hopefully it won't be something that repeats itself. But yeah, if you have a risk of fire, it definitely deserves to be on the list of worst PC products that have ever existed. Now, number 6 from 2007 is AMD's, technically, it's still ATI. AMD owned them already at this time, but they were still operating as ATI Radeon. The HD 2900 XT. It was R600 architecture, it was an 80 nanometer process, and it was a 215 watt. Let me just pause right there for a second. 215 watt back then was a lot. We got very normalized with 250 watt TDPs in the mid 2010s as the architecture shrunk, but in terms of the lithography, the giant chips and such, it became normal. But back then, for what it was, for 215 watts was insane. And this was like ATI's hot period where all their GPUs were just super hot. Like the 7950, remember how hot that sucker was? Anyway, AMD's first unified shader architecture after acquiring ATI. It was massive, power hungry, and inefficient, and it required both a 6-pin and a 8-pin connector, which is very unusual for the time because many power supplies didn't have both. They had maybe an 8-pin connector that could split into a 6-pin. And then you had to really use the Molex to 8-pin adapter, which is one of the reasons why you started seeing those included with graphics cards. The meme is just the fact that it continued to be included with graphics cards even to just a few years ago. Anyway, I digress. It underperformed because at the time, NVIDIA had the 8800 GTX out, which was just a powerhouse, insanely powerful GPU for the time, and it drew significantly, let's do it again. And even though the 8800 drew significantly more power, you got significantly more performance for that power. But its high thermals, its weak performance per watt, and its poor anti-aliasing efficiency made it literally one of the worst GPU eras for ATI as a whole. But it did lead to the far more efficient 4000 HD series graphics cards, which is where ATI/AMD really started to put itself on the map. And then if we fast forward a bit, as a little bit of a history lesson, that led all the way to the HD 7950, or the 7950 HD, which actually was beating NVIDIA at the time with the GTX 680. But back then, that's when competition was fierce, and you'll notice Intel was winning some, and then AMD was winning some, and NVIDIA was winning some, and then ATI was winning some, and it was just fun back then. And the competition amongst the fanboys was also kind of fun, because I remember I had a 680. I had 680 in SLI for a minute there, but I had a single 680, and I started to have a little bit of buyer's remorse when I saw that I could have gotten a 7950 for the same price and had better performance in Battlefield, but anyway, that FOMO is real. We know that. But back then, you could have gotten a brand and then been like, oh crap, maybe I actually made the wrong choice. Now it's just, if you want ultimate performance, the highest performing GPUs, you only have NVIDIA to look at, and that's what sucks. There's no competition today. Okay. Number 7, the Seagate 7200.11 firmware disaster of 2008. So the interface was SATA 2, was the affecting capacities of 500 gigabytes to 1.5 terabytes, and certain firmware revisions caused drives to enter a busy state permanently. That means you were not getting your data off of that drive. It could not read it because the drive was constantly telling the system, hey, I'm busy, you gotta wait. And you just couldn't get the data back. And it led to severe data loss for a lot of people because data recovery back then, and even today, extremely expensive, and average consumers were not able to just send their drives off to data recovery specialists and get their family photos back and all of that sort of stuff. It just was kind of lost forever. And honestly, I feel like this is something we've seen happen a few times, and even more recently, right, with the drive crashes and stuff with the Windows security update and causing SSDs to the controller on that to fail and have problems. Most of those drives were recoverable, but I had quite a few people message me and actually say, Jay, my drive is dead. It will not come back to life. I've lost my data off of there. So it really just goes to show how one bad firmware or BIOS update for the drives or the controllers can just lead to huge controversies in terms of data loss. Because if we had to rank this in order of impact, this would be number one. This would be number one because of the fact that the amount of data that was like collectively lost around the world was huge. All right, number 8, 2021. We remember this, right? The Gigabyte P750GM and 850GM exploding power supplies. So it was an 80+ gold certification, but that doesn't mean anything. And you have to understand, when you have what's called OPP, overpower protection, or OCP, or overcurrent protection, you might see it called a couple of different things. It's designed to make the power supply automatically have an internal breaker that will disconnect until the power is removed from the power supply for a certain amount of time. It'll reconnect to protect the power supply from sending too much current down the line to something that's either faulty, failing, shorted, whatever, right? And it's designed to do that safely. The problem was these particular power supplies had that OPP setting set way too high, way too far above its rated specs. Now here's the thing. Power supplies that say they can handle 1,000 watts, 1,200 watts, 850 watts, or whatever, can actually supply more power than that pretty regularly. Now, how far over that you go is usually a certain percentage that's sort of baked into the OPP. And then what happens is if you hit that for too long, then it will actually trigger the power supply because it has to be able to handle transient spikes. When you're dealing with graphics cards and other high power draw parts, when you put something under load instantaneously, you can kind of hit the system with a huge spike of power draw, and then it comes back down and normalizes. You've got V-droop, you've got all sorts of other things that can lead to these transient spikes. The power supply has to be able to intelligently understand it's dealing with a transient spike. Don't shut itself off, but monitor that to make sure that transient spike isn't something bad that's happening, but it's something that's expected to be happening based on the use case. But the problem is Gigabyte set that threshold way too high. So you could actually overstress the capacitors and the transformers inside the power supply to where they would catastrophically fail. Remember this clip?
And then hit this power supply on button. Oh, fuck.
That was the most impressive one. We're gonna get a blast shield for future ones. Is that expected behavior, Stone? That's what they're supposed to do, right?
So that obviously is a huge issue on here because any transformer or cap that likes to explode is also a potential fire hazard. It also potentially could take everything connected to it out on the system. Actually happened to me when I popped the 1500 watt power supply from Corsair by doing the XOC stuff. The transient spikes or something, it was dimming an LED light. LEDs are not supposed to dim if you don't want them to. Poor QA and insufficient and improper protection tuning leads to that being a huge blunder and definitely deserves to be on this list. Okay, number 9, I remember reviewing these. There's not even really a year on here because of the fact that it went on for a while. Intel Optane SSDs. Remember that? You want a faster drive? Plug in our Optane SSD and use it as a cache drive. It just didn't take off. I mean, it was built on 3D XPoint. It was extremely low latency because of the amount of data that was on there, but its cost per gigabyte was extremely high. Remember, these were very low drives, like 32 gigabyte drives, maybe 64 gigabyte drives as a whole, because they were nothing but a cache. It took up an NVMe slot. It was nothing but data getting moved from your most used information and programs and files that you were accessing. Instead of just being on a small cache that's on your SSD, you could make a huge cache on the Optane drive, and then that's what your system would start interacting with. But unfortunately, if you were doing a lot of different stuff, there was constantly files being swapped back and forth between those, and it really just lost its use case because of the fact that it was constantly having to recache information. So it just was a huge blunder. And as NAND prices dropped on SSDs and the capacity, back then, not now, back then, as capacities went up and prices dropped, it just made Optane completely obsolete. Because remember, if you have a 2 terabyte drive or a 4 terabyte drive, you have a bigger cache available to you on that drive. A certain portion of that drive gets set as cache, and it's usually a percentage of the drive. So much bigger drives have a bigger cache. And they quickly outpaced the capacity of the Intel Optane drives. And then if you wanted to buy a bigger Optane drive as a cache drive, now you're just throwing money away and utilizing a slot and bifurcating for no reason whatsoever. And last but not least, this should come as absolutely no surprise and doesn't really need a whole lot of introduction. 12 volt high power. Easily by far the biggest failure of a improvement to a PC product ever. The whole purpose of 12 volt high power was supposed to be a single, unified, standardized power plug for GPU manufacturers. Because if you think about it, GPU manufacturers were either using a single 6-pin or a single 8-pin for maybe lower end GPUs and entry level GPUs, maybe a 6-pin and an 8-pin back when like 20 series was around, you have a 6-pin and an 8-pin, or 2 8-pins, or 3 8-pins. As the GPUs got bigger and bigger and bigger, the power plugs got bigger and bigger and bigger. Now what was starting to happen too was as CPUs were becoming more power inefficient and more hungry, you were starting to have 2 EPS powers on motherboards, right? And so people were automatically plugging in both of those, or some CPUs just for safety reasons required them. Let's just say a la Threadripper and like X299, X99 era of Intel when they had the Extreme processors. You know, you would need to occupy both of those CPU EPS power headers. On Threadripper, you have to occupy both of them, sometimes 4 of them, depending on the processor, but that's an outlier. But as you started having more of these connections and these higher capacity graphics cards that were requiring more power, up to 3 of those 8-pin PCI Express connectors, and back when SLI was still a thing, don't forget, when 12 volt high power was developed, SLI was still a thing. So they had to account for the fact that if you wanted to have 2 EPS power plugged in on your motherboard and 2 graphics card utilizing potentially up to 6 PCI Express, power supplies did not have enough ports on the 12 volt rail for all of that. So they tried to come up with this unified PCI SIG and NVIDIA and Intel and everyone that was involved in all this design tried to come up with a unified connector that was supposed to be a one-stop solution, that it didn't matter if it was a low-end graphics card or a high-end graphics card, one plug, one cable, one solution. One solution to the worst design ever created, because they shrunk it so unnecessarily small that it led to huge issues when it came to complexity of wire gauge and insulation, the sense pins, thinner wires can break easily within the insulation. The size of the graphics cards was getting so big, they weren't taking into account the fact that you've got to put a tight bend on that cable sometimes to fit between your side glass, or some people not being able to put their side glass back on at all led to the perfect storm of being able to have your power connector just absolutely melt. And we are not convinced around here, and so many other people are not convinced around here, although other outlets have reported that this is all user error because it's not plugged in all the way, that it's more than that. And we know it's more than that. Too much evidence exists that it's more than that, including smaller, lower end graphics cards like the 9070 XT Nitro card, which uses the 12 volt 2x6 connector, also melting. So rather than saying we screwed up and allowing the design to be 2 of those, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of trying to shrink it down, right? Because now if you're putting 2, you're starting to use as much real estate on the board as 2 8-pins would have been. They just doubled down on this and tried to fix it with pin revisions and both the male pin and the female pin revisions and the tightness of which the cable can connect and the angled adapters to try and make sure that you're not bending it too far. Or in my opinion, it's an unfixable problem. And I don't know if we'll ever see that cable change, but it needs to. In my opinion, I don't know why they had to make it so small. It could have stayed a 6-pin ground and a 6-pin 12 volt, but make it a bigger gauge and just maybe 50% larger, and it still would have been less real estate on the board. People would have been happy because it's like one plug, there we go, that's it. Don't have to worry about, do I have 8, do I have 6, or do I have 3 8-pins, or do I have a 6-pin and 2 8-pins, or whatever the hell combination it could have been. Everyone would have been happy, but no, they had to make it so small for unnecessary reasons that it's now led to this bullshit. And it came out in 2022, so we've got 4 years of this so far. And I hope when that cable gets changed, because it's gonna have to change someday. I mean, it's gonna have to. I don't think this can survive forever. We're We're gonna look at this as the dark era, the dark ages, for many reasons, but that's one of them. Anyway, that's my top 10. I'm curious what your top 10 are. I'm sure you guys have stuff that aren't on this list, and maybe you don't agree with some of the stuff that's on this list. So, what is your opinion, the top 10 worst PC products that ever existed? All right, guys, thanks for watching. As always, we'll see you in the next one.